story of this magnificent house begins in 1900 when then college president Dr. John McBride proposed the construction of a new home as a means to allow the reuse of the existing president's house. We find the following in the minutes from the June 13, 1900 Board of Visitors meeting. It was resolved that the house now occupied by the president be converted into an infirmary, according to the plans submitted with the several bids, and that a president's house be erected to be of brick and in such plans as the president and executive committee may adapt, at a cost not exceeding $10,000 complete. The location chosen for the new home was this knoll, which was then at the extreme western edge of the campus, surrounded by these large oak trees and referred to as the Grove. The area already possessed historical significance as part of the original Smithfield plantation, which was the home of the prominent Preston family. Furthermore, it overlooked Solitude, which was, it still is, the oldest building on campus. Various farm buildings and cottages were removed from the site, and then construction began in 1901. Although few records regarding the construction survive, apparently both college personnel and the Roanoke architectural firm of H.H. Huggins participated in planning the house. William W. Gray, a local contractor, was the builder, and as we can see, the structure was brick as specified, and it was designed in a classical revival style. The design was for a two-story house with 6 bedrooms, 3 parlors, a full basement, and an attic. The floor area totaled just under 11,000 square feet. So it was that Dr. McBride, the 5th president of Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College and Polytechnic Institute, and his family became the first residents of the Grove in the spring of 1902. At that time, President McBride was reported to have said, "The President's house was finished in April. It is a beautiful building and admirably harmonizes with its situation and surroundings." Historical records tell us that the house quickly became a center for various campus social events. The following excerpts are from Colonel Harry Temple's The Bugle's Echo, and they give us a picture of the vibrant social life at the Grove around 1903. Susie McBride frequently entertained groups of 20 to 30 cadets at parties at the Grove, and Mary Lacey, the newly appointed full-time college librarian, was a competent and enthusiastic partner in the events. She contributed substantially to the making of decorations and the playing of popular games and contests. There always were a dozen ice cream freezers of the hand crank type on the back porch. The McBrides were very sociable and entertained often. Even at Susie's parties, Dr. McBride would leave his study door open and welcome to any cadet who might wish to drop in and talk to him. This gives us a sense of the importance of this house to what was at the turn of the century, of the 20th century, a very small and rural campus. The McBride family resided at the Grove until Dr. McBride stepped down in 1907. Then from 1907 to 1913, President Paul Barringer and his family were occupants of the Grove. During this time, all accounts were that the Grove remained a center for many campus social gatherings. The Grove continued to serve the campus during the tenure of President Eggleston from 1913 to 1919, and during the long presidency of Julian Burruss from 1919 to 1945. But time began to take a toll on the house. Even though in 1922 a 2-car brick garage was added beyond the east side of the house, and some remodeling was done in 1925, the house and grounds suffered from from some neglect. At the end of President Burruss's tenure, the grove had deteriorated to the point that he doubted if it could continue to serve as the president's house. He even recommended that maybe it should be converted into a dormitory for women students. Despite Dr. Burruss's recommendation, the grove continued to serve as the president's home, next for President Hutchinson, and then for President Walter Newman. In 1950, under the guidance of Dr. and Mrs. Newman, major renovations were undertaken. Closets and additional bathrooms were added for the guest rooms. 2 downstairs bedrooms were converted to an office and a sitting room. The direction of the stairwell was altered, and several fireplaces were closed. Changes also included the laying of brickwork outside the front steps to form a patio. Improvements were made to the kitchen. A new heating system was installed, as were new electrical outlets. The exterior and interior woodwork was painted, the floors were refinished, and the old wallpaper was replaced. Of particular note is the Chinese block print wallpaper, which was added to the foyer. These improvements rejuvenated the interior and brought the house into alignment with technology and the patterns of living for the mid-20th century. Then we move forward to 1962, when Dr. T. Marshall Hahn became Virginia Tech's president, following Dr. Newman. The Hahn family lived at the Grove from 1962 until 1971. For the next 17 years, the house was assigned for use by various academic and administrative units. While some alterations were made to adapt the house to its new use, the basic structure and layout remained intact. After the Hahn family moved out, then the house for 17 years really was assigned to use for various academic and administrative units. And then in 1988, portions of the house were extensively renovated, which then allowed the Grove to return to be the president's on-campus home. Part of this renovation was the restoration of the block print wallpaper that I mentioned earlier that was installed in 1950. And this restoration work was done by the physical plant department, actually. In 1989, Dr. James McComas and Mrs. McComas moved to the Grove, and the reinstatement of the Grove as the president's house received much media attention. The campus community was pleased to have the Grove again serve as the president's home. It continued on as the president's home to the present time. It served during the remainder of the McComas' stay on campus, and then for President Paul Torgerson as well. The last significant renovation of the Grove began in the year 2000, and this was at the beginning of President Steger's tenure. The scope of work included interior renovations to the areas of the house which were not addressed in the 1988 renovation. There were also improvements to the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, as well as a fair amount of exterior repairs. Most notably, there was a total reworking of the Buckingham slate roof on the house. Also, a freestanding garage was constructed just southeast of the main house, and it was of modern dimensions. The garage that was constructed in 1925 or 22 actually was for cars of that era, and so modern cars really didn't fit in to that garage. So in closing, I'd like to say that over its 104-year life, the Grove has served and continues to serve the university community in many ways, but its primary identity is as a gracious and hospitable residence.
So we have here, as was mentioned by Scott, a house in the colonial revival style. And it was built at the height of that style's popularity, and it was designed by its most prominent local practitioner. The colonial revival as a style has become perhaps so common that we almost don't notice its prevalence around us, but it really is a style that begins in the latter part of the 19th century. And this is a period of time in which America is rapidly diversifying ethnically. Of course, this is the period in which all the great immigrations from particularly Eastern and Southern Europe are taking place. And also, the American economy is making a rapid transition from predominantly rural and smaller towns, smaller urban base, to something that's predominantly urban and predominantly industrial. And there are some architectural historians who see the colonial revival as something of a response to these conditions. At a time when America is really beginning to change its identity quite rapidly, there seems to be a need to establish a stable central image of national identity. So the colonial revival as a style had a certain set of meanings attached to it, which contributed to its popularity. It really stood for the beginnings of America, for the world of the founders of the country, a world that was still predominantly rural, that was still based in a small community of mostly homogeneous individuals. Now it's interesting also to think about what the word colonial meant. And doing a little research on it, I found that up until the 20th century, in the 19th century, if you used the term colonial, you could mean anything from the very first settlements in New England and Virginia back in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, all the way up to the 1840s. In other words, anything really before the kind of period of Jackson is sometimes referred to or thought of as colonial. So that would include a whole variety of architectural styles. It included, for example, the heavy timber framed wooden houses of New England that were built in the 17th century, or the brick houses on the eastern shores of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas that were built in the 17th century. But it also meant the Georgian, and this is the use and the style that really came to symbolize or dominate colonial revival. And by Georgian is meant, of course, the architecture predominantly the 18th century in the United States, which was a borrowing of the style that had developed in England about the same time. We're probably most familiar with that when we go to Williamsburg. We see really a town built in the style of Georgian architecture. But we also have at least one local example, and that would be Smithfield Plantation, which doesn't look like Williamsburg until you look closely at the details and realize that this is what the Georgian looked like on the frontier, which is where Blacksburg was at the time. But it could also mean styles like the Federalist style, or even the work of Thomas Jefferson. And sometimes, really stretching the idea of colonial very far, it could even be used to refer to Greek revival. But for the most part, as we see in this house, it really centers around the idea of the revival of Georgian plans, Georgian ornament, and so forth. Now, there were very few examples of what we would think of as colonial revival that were built before the Civil War. Washington Irving, whom we might remember as being fascinated by the colonial period, actually built his house Sunnyside in New York as a kind of Dutch colonial revival. But really, interest in the colonial revival as a style of architecture doesn't begin until 1876, the 100th anniversary, the centennial, and is touched off by the Philadelphia World's Fair, in which two of the state pavilions out of Massachusetts and Connecticut were built as replicas of Georgian era houses. And there was a lot of publicity about this, and people really began to associate the Georgian as a style with this idea of a return to America's roots. Now, so was interest beginning about that time, but it really was touched off during the latter part of the century, when certain academically trained architects such as McKinley and White began to pick up and design very expansive private homes in a colonial revival style. You may be familiar with the architects McKinley and White, very well known for their work at the Boston Public Library, as well as on the committees that renovated Washington, D.C. They designed a house for Newport, Rhode Island, the H.A.C. Taylor House in 1885, that was widely publicized and really helped to move the colonial revival into the forefront. Beaux-Arts architects tended to associate the colonial revival with Renaissance architecture, because after all, the Georgian style that American architecture was modeled in England had been the result of the use of Renaissance architecture by Palladio and his followers as its model. So they can make that connection. And so it was really pushed very much by these academically, mostly French-trained architects. So by the beginning of the 20th century, colonial revival had become the most popular domestic style. And it replaced older styles that had really flourished in the middle and later 19th century, particularly the Italianate, of which we have a fine example in Blacksburg. The Thomas Connor House is an Italianate mansion. And also the Queen Anne, of which the Alexander Black House, now being restored, is an excellent example. So as we've heard, the Grove was built in 1901 to 1902 for President John M. McBride. The site was part of the Smithfield Plantation. And the architect was H.H. Huggins of Roanoke. Now, he's not very well known nationally, but locally, H.H. Huggins is responsible for some of the best known buildings in southwestern Virginia, particularly the Roanoke area. He was an architect with offices in Roanoke. He was the designer of the West Dormitory at Hollins College, which was built in 1900. And then one of his best known buildings, Firehouse No. 1 in downtown Roanoke, even if you know where that is, right off Kirk Avenue, or Church rather, was also designed by H.H. Huggins in 1907. This building is on the National Register. A house that's comparable in its size and in its style to the Grove is Mountain View, which is a very fine house in southwest Roanoke. And this was designed for Junius Blair Fishburne, who was a banker and newspaper publisher at the time. Of course, the Fishburne family is still prominent. And then finally, one of his better known buildings, the Roanoke County Courthouse in Salem, Virginia, was designed by H.H. Huggins. So we can see that this house came a little early in his career, and that Huggins had developed by this time and a few years later into being the most prominent architect of the colonial revival. When we look at the house in specific, we can see that although Neo-Georgian in general, it's not specific to any particular period or historical example. It's something of a mixture with elements borrowed from different buildings of the era. For example, we might compare this giant order of columns which supports this portico, and the relationship between that and this porch or veranda, or as I was mentioning in the 19th century, what was referred to as for some inexplicable reason, as a piazza. You might compare this to the pavilions that Thomas Jefferson designed for the Great Lawn at University of Virginia. I don't know if I could bring that in, but unfortunately it's true. Also, you have some elements from a little bit later era. For example, these bowed windows, which you can find some examples in Federalist-style architecture from the early 19th century. So it's something of a bit of an eclectic and individual expression, as opposed to being any kind of particular copy of another existing building. So here we have it. Just to finish up, we have a landmark house, which is not only a landmark for Virginia Tech, but a landmark for the history of architecture in Southwest Virginia.